This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
What does the Bible say about dinosaurs? And does their existence disprove what Genesis 1 and 2 says about creation? Modern scientists will tell you that these creatures lived millions of years ago. We've all heard of these periods of time that they lived, like the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic periods, so far back that these periods themselves are like tens of millions of years in duration. It's hard to imagine those lengths of time, and it's also hard to imagine that if things were indeed that far back, that fossils that survived that length of time could possibly have anything other than stone-like characteristics. Well, in 2005, a scientist named Mary Schweitzer was studying a T-Rex bone and accidentally made a discovery that challenged everything. It made national news, and lots of people wanted to talk about it, and she was even interviewed on CBS on the long-time-running show 60 Minutes.
Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast, and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was, and it was elastic, like living tissue.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone. This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what? You
I didn't want to tell anybody.
You'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
That interview goes on to try and explain how this could be possible. Dr. Schweitzer still believes in the evolutionary paradigm and that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, but the creation scientific community has taken her research and has been able to replicate it and continue to make observations that would support the creationist view that dinosaurs lived and died only thousands of years ago. So Henry had a chance to talk with Dr. Kevin Anderson about dinosaurs in the Bible and some of his research that's been done on dinosaur soft proteins. Dr. Anderson is the director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center in Arizona, as well as the project leader of the Creation Research Society's iDINO project, which is an investigation of the preservation of tissue in dinosaur fossils. This conversation is actually from a couple years ago, and since it was recorded, Dr. Anderson has passed away and went to be with the Lord. But the research is still continuing, and what he and Henry talked about is still relevant and interesting, so we wanted to share it with you.
Dr. Anderson, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad that you're here, and thank you for joining us all the way from Arizona. Let's begin by introducing you to the audience a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are. You're with the Creation Research Society, but give us a little bit of background and what you do there and why you do it.
Well, the Creation Research Society is a society of biblical creationists. It was founded in 1963. And its primary purpose is to do research and publish supporting the inerrancy of Scripture from the very first verse, that the Bible, the creation account in Genesis, is both historically and scientifically accurate. And they have a research center, the Van Andel Creation Research Center here in Arizona, and I'm the director of that research center. And we are scientists. That's what we do. We do the research. We get in and we throw out the challenges and we investigate. And so what I'm doing right now, of course, is research actually in laboratory dealing with dinosaurs. And so this is all part of the overall structure, overall focus of the Creation Research Society is to conduct this type of research.
That's excellent. I became familiar with your organization the early days after I became a Christian over 20 years ago, and I was just, enthralled with it. A lot of it I didn't fully understand because I'm not a trained scientist, but I understood the purpose of what you guys were trying to do. We have the creation account given in the Bible. We have this great flood that occurs. And of course, we have these conflicting paradigms, the evolutionary long age paradigm.
Right.
and the biblical paradigm.
If the Bible is
yes.
what we claim it to be, then it's going to be historically accurate. If historically accurate, you can do scientific verification of that, and that's what we do, and that's what we found.
Yes, that's excellent. So today, particularly, we're gonna focus our attention, as I said, on these animals, these amazing creatures. Children love them. We love them as adults. Hollywood loves them. Dinosaurs. So let's talk about that. Let's set the stage a little bit. Talk a little bit about, dinosaurs and their relationship to the Bible. Does the Bible mention dinosaurs? What does the word mean, and that sort of thing?
Of course, the word dinosaur wasn't really coined until the 19th century. So you could hardly expect that the writers of the Bible are going to be using that term. So when people say, well, we don't see dinosaur in the Bible, that's just foolishness, because that's not what you would expect to see anyway. There's not going to be the usage of a word in the Bible that wasn't developed till the 19th century. But what you do have in Hebrew is a word that does particularly mean some kind of monster, some kind of large creature. It's frequently translated as dragon, although some of the newer translations are getting softer on it. They translate it as jackal and such.
Yes.
But this word can certainly be viewed as possible referring to dinosaurs, and clearly dinosaurs would have been created along with the other great beasts of the earth on the sixth day. So there's nothing biblically that excludes dinosaurs in that regard. It's just that they're not mentioned with the word dinosaur, but they're certainly referenced to great creatures, to great monsters. And then, of course, you have the behemoth in Job, which is clearly a creature that is much larger and more ferocious and such than we would see of any creatures that would be, alive today. So this is clearly described. God in Job is describing a creature that doesn't exist today, and it would make sense that God is describing one of the creatures that we would call a dinosaur.
Yeah, it does seem to make sense, and we do have, we have to understand our theology, right? That these creatures are created by God. Right. He created all life on earth, and in the creation account, we have the land animals being created on the sixth day. So that implies something quite radical, Dr. Anderson, and compared to what we've all been taught, and that is
very radical.
That these animals were created when Adam was created.
Right.
Expand on that a little bit, because a lot of people are going to say, "Wait a minute, what are you guys trying to do?" But let's talk about that. Let's explore it.
That dinosaurs and humans would have been contemporary, that the Flintstones weren't that far off, in that regard. Yes, right. The contemporary evolutionist community would mock that idea. Well, dinosaurs died out tens of millions of years before anything even close to humans was on the face of the earth. But the Bible would certainly indicate that dinosaurs and humans lived and walked together. We would say that the scientific data also supports that dinosaurs and humans walked together. And you got to recognize it wasn't that the T-Rex was running around consuming people. That wouldn't have started to have occurred until after the flood, because the fear of man had not been placed into animals until after the flood. So we don't have any biblical reason to assume that there were ferocious man-eating creatures, even lions and tigers, that existed before the flood. So it wasn't a matter of, Noah and the family had to keep running from the T-Rexes on the ark. That wouldn't have been the case. That would not have been the situation. Plus, the ark would have almost certainly had very small, perhaps even infant, newborn dinosaurs on it. You wouldn't, no reason to bring the large, older ones on. And so I think even if they did have a little bit of a mean streak, I think you can contain a fairly small dinosaur without too much problem. So those are just caricatures that are thrown out to try to mock the Bible, but they're not either logical or consistent with Scripture or science.
Yeah, again, we are proposing something that a lot of people probably haven't heard before, but we think that it can be defended and it makes sense, and it
can absolutely be defended. Yes.
And it's consistent with Scripture. We would say also, dinosaurs did die out, many of them in a great catastrophe, but it wasn't a meteorite impact or something like that. We believe that they died out in the flood.
Exactly.
Let's jump right into the particulars of this research you're doing. Let's talk about dinosaur proteins and tissues that have been discovered by secular scientists, and how unexpected that is, and go with it, because I think our audience will be fascinated by what you have to say.
For the past several decades, in fact, I think we can find studies going back even into at least the 60s, if not the 50s. There's been some tantalizing suggestion that there may still be pieces of proteins left in dinosaur fossils. And of course, that was immediately rejected, like, oh, that'd be impossible, because nobody would believe that a protein, a biological molecule like a protein, could begin to survive for tens of millions of years. See, the youngest dinosaur fossil is supposed to be, 65 plus million years of age. Right. Most of them even older than that. But in 2005, then a very extensive study was done and published, and this research was led by a researcher named Mary Schweitzer, who's become very popular in this area now.
Yes.
And she published a paper, her team published a paper where they were suggesting that indeed they had found pieces of some dinosaur proteins and some cells still in the dinosaur bone. And they followed it up very quickly with an even more intensive study in 2007, and an even more intensive study in 2009, and an even more intensive study here in the last few years. It has now come, and other labs have now started doing as well. We've done our own discoveries as well. So we now have a number of different labs reporting the detection of dinosaur proteins and tissue and biological material in the fossils. And so for the most part now, it's being recognized that this would appear to be authentic. But obviously the problem that the evolution community has now is, okay, how in the world can we explain that this biological material has somehow survived these tens of millions of years? I mean, we have biological material being found in fossils that are 100, 180, almost 200 million years. And in fact, there's some tantalizing evidence of some biologic material in Cambrian fossils that date back, over 450 million years. So it seems that it's all across the geologic column. It's not just one particular area. It's not just one particular set of fossils.
Well, that's very fascinating because, okay, so obviously you want to explore this scientifically, which you've, of course, done, and they're trying to do, and there's a conflict here about this long-age paradigm. Instinctively, though, as a layman, I got to tell you, I read about this stuff years ago, and I said, how could this material last for so long? So one of the things that you guys have done to explore that very question is you started what you call the iDINO project.
Correct.
Let's build on what you just shared about your iDINO project, what you're doing with that, and just share with the audience the importance of that project. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Creation Research Society started its iDINO project, stands for Investigation of Dinosaur Intact Natural Osteotissue. Nice mouthful.
Yes.
But that's why we call it iDINO, to give it kind of a catchy name so people could remember that. And the whole purpose of iDINO was that we had the technology, we had the expertise as creationists that we knew we could do this research also, and we didn't want the evolutionists to be solely setting the tone and direction of the research. Not that there hasn't been some good research done. We certainly applaud Mary Schweitzer and her group for doing some very, very good work over the years.
Yes.
But we were just very concerned that there may also be some research that they would not want to do because it would be definitely difficult as an evolutionist to publish. In fact, Mary Schweitzer even mentions how difficult it was to publish the first paper. She talks about vacillating for a long time before publishing because she knew this is going to be a challenge to the evolutionary time frame. That you've got dinosaurs they're claiming are, over 65 million years old. Fossils they're claiming are over 65 million years old. And the idea there's biological material, see, that's inconsistent with everything we know about biochemistry, which it still is inconsistent with everything we know about biochemistry. So it is a problem for them. And the evolutionists been spending, the last several years trying to explain how would this material have lasted so long. And they have several models, if you will, several proposals.
Yes.
And part of our research, part of the iDINO project, is we are investigating those models. We feel like that sometimes the evolutionist community proposes a model and then they kind of back off and like, okay, we've explained it now, and they don't do what we would consider the necessary in-depth analysis of it. So we turn around and we investigate it more closely. So does this really explain it? Does this really work? And so that's part of what we do in the iDINO project, is just continue to challenge them as far as, does this explanation really serve as a plausible mechanism of how you're going to get proteins surviving for 70, 100, 150 million years in the ground, which is hardly ideal conditions.
Yes. So what I hear you saying, just I'm paraphrasing, they're trying to say, we got to keep the paradigm. That is,
absolutely.
The
paradigm comes first.
The paradigm comes first. Long ages, the dinosaurs lived long before man. That whole model, let's try to find a way to figure out how proteins could remain intact for these long ages of time. And so you are examining and critiquing these theories, and you're discovering what?
See, the problem that the evolution community has is, if they've dated some of the dinosaur fossils wrong, then that means probably all fossils were dated wrong. And so they're really committed to the dates they've put. And when you have very strong evidence that these fossils are not that old, it challenges the entire dating scheme of the evolutionist paradigm.
Yeah, and that, of course, involves not only changing the paradigm, but also potentially, as human beings, potentially changing worldview. And that's
absolutely,
and that's a big deal.
Yes, because the evolutionist community is trying to put together mechanisms that would explain how this biological material, particularly fragments of proteins, could survive for all these tens of millions of years. One of the major focuses at the moment of the iDINO project is then to look at what they're proposing. For example, one of the proposals has been that the iron in the bloodstream of the dinosaur, the red blood cells would contain iron, of course, in the hemoglobin. Iron chemically is a catalyst. It can catalyze a lot of reactions. And they're saying, well, the iron in the bloodstream could have catalyzed reactions that we would call cross-links. In other words, just make the protein just tie itself up into knots.
Okay.
Which, of course, would make it not functional as a protein, but the animal's already dead, so that's not the important thing. The important thing is, by tying it up into knots, the suggestion is that makes it more resistant to degradation, which is true. It does, but does it make it resistant for 60 plus million years of degradation?
Yes.
And so that's been one of the very, very popular models the last few years, is what I call the iron model. And so some of the work we have done has been challenging the idea that this kind of cross-linking can be that type of preserving mechanism. See, one of the contradictions is that if you're going to cross-link this biological material, then it's not going to be stretchy. Cross-linking actually reduces flexibility, and yet the biological material we're pulling out is very stretchable, very flexible. The Creation Research Society publishes a video called Echoes of the Jurassic.
Yes.
And if people watch that video, they will see video of us pulling pieces of soft material from dinosaur fossils. Now, if that soft material was heavily cross-linked to preserve it, it wouldn't be very stretchy.
It would be stiff.
So exactly. So they're kind of contradicting themselves. They're trying to use a mechanism that they hope would explain the preservation of the protein, but it doesn't explain the preservation of the flexible, stretchable, soft tissue.
Yeah.
So that's the problem they have, is when you propose a mechanism, it often contradicts other situations. So
it can't account for the data. So in one way, they're saying, if I hear you right too, I'm going to reiterate for the audience, you correct me if I'm wrong, is there is mechanisms that preserve protein. There's a sort of a way to say a protein can last this long under certain conditions. It could last longer under these conditions. But there's no way to extrapolate it to the eons of time that are required.
Correct.
And that is the continued challenge that they have. Is that right? Is that right? Am I explaining that correctly?
That is correct. Yes. You have conditions that could explain tissue being able to survive for quite a few thousand years.
Yes.
Maybe even hundreds of thousands of years under the right conditions. But there's no biochemical mechanism known to man that would preserve this material for tens of millions of years. And to get a little more specific, the main protein they're detecting is a protein called collagen.
Yes.
Collagen is the most common protein in any animal or human body, or any vertebrate human body. But they've also found fragments of other proteins, actin, myosin, tubulin. Now, these proteins are not near as resistant to degradation as collagen is. See, collagen's fairly resistant to degradation, but these other proteins, they're not near as resistant. So any mechanism you propose to preserve collagen doesn't necessarily fit the other proteins. So again, as we just mentioned, they propose a mechanism to try to explain something, but it doesn't explain everything. And in fact, sometimes it contradicts other discoveries. So when you're trying to propose something that doesn't exist, and that is a mechanism to explain preservation of biological material for tens of millions of years, that's what's going to happen. You're going to find that nothing's going to work because it just simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, it can't explain all of the data. We do this in archaeology too. You have a paradigm, or you have a working hypothesis, if you want to say it that way, and you have to explain the data within that. And if it begins to contradict it, typically what you do, if given enough time, if you have enough problems, you start to throw out the paradigm. But our evolutionary friends, and even in the Christian community, we have brethren who believe the Bible. They proclaim Jesus, but they believe the Bible teaches long ages. And of course, we would disagree with that. That's also a challenge within the church as well. Maybe you could talk about that.
I think, again, a lot of people, they're listening to the scientific community, and they're assuming that the scientific community, first off, is always correct.
Yeah.
They're assuming the scientific community is always going to be cold and objective and such, and none of that is true. The scientific community can make some very wonderful discoveries, but when the scientific community starts getting into worldview areas, see, then science doesn't do as well. And the paradigm can rule just as strongly in science as it can in anything. And when the paradigm is right now evolution, then that's what has to fit. And it doesn't make any difference what the data is. It's got to fit through the lens of evolution. And so right now, a lot of Christians are listening and assuming the scientific community must be correct. Therefore, somehow the Bible has to bend to all of that, which, of course, then we're not really believing that the Bible is the authoritative word of God. We're saying that science is the authoritative word of God.
Yeah.
But science is a man-made venture. It is successful, but it's also fallible. And we've got to recognize that when people say, well, science says, well, that's not true. Science doesn't say anything. Science is simply a tool.
Yeah,
humans say.
Yeah,
yes. And humans do a lot of saying they probably shouldn't say too. So
yeah, that's right. Let's talk about some other dinosaurs. Like, give some more examples. I know the Mary Schweitzer's dinosaur was a T-Rex, but there's been other stuff that's been discovered as well. Go ahead with that, and I'll let you run with it.
One of her dinosaurs is a T-Rex. It's a T-Rex femur they pulled out of the Hell Creek Formation in eastern Montana.
Yes.
And that was a lot of what she did. A lot of her PhD work on was that particular femur. In fact, how some of her work started was the T-Rex femur was large enough and it was down in a canyon area enough that they couldn't really carry it out. So they had to helicopter it out, but the helicopter couldn't pick up the entire femur. So they had to break it in half, which obviously as a paleontologist, last thing you want to do is break up this beautiful fossil.
Yeah.
But in so doing, then they began to recognize that there's something inside this fossil that is not fossil. And so she started looking at it closer. And her background is a little bit more of a cell biology background rather than a geology, paleontology background. And so she more quickly recognized, perhaps than a trained geologist or paleontologist would have recognized, that this is biological inside this fossil. And so that's kind of what led to some of her initial work. And now, since then, she's worked with several other fossils, including the femur of a hadrosaur as well. Okay. And so there has, by this time, actually been between the different labs around the world, there's probably been at least a couple, I don't have an exact list in front of me, but at least a couple dozen different dinosaur fossils now that have been found to have tissue from all around the world, not just a specific location in north central United States, but all around the world, fossils in China, in Poland, and such. So it's not something that's just a particular condition found in one location for certain fossils.
Excellent. Now, I read in some of your material a couple things you published, and I remember this very specifically. You comment on this. There's been other stuff discovered. You mentioned in the first segment, but I'm going to return to this. If I remember right, I think something called a beard worm. Is that right?
Yes.
Do I have that correct? And
that is correct.
The standard date is about 500 million years old on this beard worm. Talk about this so-called beard worm. This is very interesting.
Yeah. And a scorpion as well. Yes. These date back into the standard date puts them at approximately 500 million years. And yet there is certainly evidence, because we now are analytically capable of detecting very, very trace amounts of material. And so there's certainly evidence that these are containing pieces of protein still in them. And obviously that means it hasn't yet fossilized, because a true fossil would have nothing identified as biological. A true fossil is all the biological has been replaced by mineral, particularly silica and calcium carbonate.
Yes.
So if it has not been replaced yet, then that means it still retains some of its biological chemistry, and we can detect that. And in fact, that's what they're doing now. We have, by this time, we have enough technological advancement. We can detect very trace amounts of biological material. It's not fossilized yet in these 500 million year old fossils.
Yeah.
So then our argument would be, are you sure they're 500 million year old?
Yeah. And it, again, I mean, that problem, the dinosaurs from 65 to 200 and some odd million years old, and they found this protein material and other things. Now you get this worm that's allegedly 500 million years old.
Yes.
And it's got some organic material in it. I mean, that's got to be looked at. I mean, that kind of screams, out at you. Shorter time frame.
It's not just any organic material. It's organic material associated with biological organisms.
Yeah.
That's the key. This is not just something that just you find organic material here or there. Anyway, this is organic material that comes from animals, that comes from life.
Yes.
And so this is not a result of contamination. This is from what was there initially.
In the animal. Now, I want to introduce a discovery that you and your organization made of a triceratops horn that you guys have worked with. And I'll let you run with it.
In 2012, the Creation Research Society sent a team of us to, again, an area in the Hell Creek Formation in eastern Montana, and we dug up a almost 4 foot long triceratops horn. This horn was almost 4 foot long. It was a monster horn.
Yes.
And this clearly was not all of it. In other words, some of it was exposed out the end of the cliff, which is how we knew it was there to begin with. So it was obviously even longer than that. And this was, as far as our guides knew, this was the longest triceratops horn that had ever been found in the eastern part of Montana, perhaps in all of Montana. And of course, that we were going to take and break it up was just, very disturbing to them, because this would have made a beautiful museum piece. But the price of science, we wanted it to examine. And so Mark Armitage at that time was our microscopist, and he gave it a very thorough microscopic examination and found some very fascinating stuff. There was nice pieces of stretchable material, and some video of that is in that movie, Is Genesis History. If you've seen that movie, that's some of the stretchable material that was found in this horn. And also beautiful pictures of intact cells that are called osteocytes. Osteocytes are bone cells.
Okay.
And they're very specific cells. This is not a contaminating skin cell, because skin cells look entirely different. Osteocytes have their own unique structure.
Okay.
And Mary Schweitzer and her team have also found osteocytes in her fossils as well. And so these cells are still intact. They haven't decomposed. They haven't deteriorated. And so it's beautiful preservation of these cells, along with this nice stretchable tissue. And so what we're seeing in this horn is wonderful examples of all the preservation that occurred in supposedly a horn that should be about 68 million years of age.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is we found this horn about a foot down from the surface. Now, what makes that interesting is if you're buried real deep, then you could argue that, well, the fossil is protected from all the thermal variation from the winter, weather changes and the rain and such, but only a foot down. It's going to be exposed to the very, very cold of the Montana winter, the very, very hot of the Montana summer. You're also going to have intercalating, penetrating rainwater. In fact, when we pulled the horn up, it was damp underneath. And in fact, I turned to Mark Armitage and said, well, there's no way we're going to find anything in this because it's wet, it's muddy. There's not going to be. So even from a creationist perspective, I didn't expect to find anything. And lo and behold, there was all kinds of tissue in there. So what we're looking at is anything but pristine preservation. And there's no way that you can logically, in everything we know about biochemistry, you can logically argue that this horn is older than just a few thousand years. And even then, it's a bit surprising there was tissue, but certainly you can't say that this horn is millions and millions of years old and still have this kind of tissue.
A foot.
It just was exposed. Yeah, a foot. It was just exposed
from the surface.
Too much. Yes, a foot from the surface.
Yeah.
So
it had everything going against it in terms of preservation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Water, mud, infiltration of potential plant material, certainly temperature fluctuations. Any biochemist can tell you the fastest way to destroy proteins and the fastest way to destroy tissue is to put it through temperature fluctuations. Hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold.
Yeah.
That will destroy biological material faster than anything. And that's what this horn would have been exposed to, was hot, cold, rainwater, penetrating, plant material, microbes. So it was exposed to everything that would tell us that there's no way that this tissue would survive more than just a few thousand years.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to encourage our viewers to watch the movie Is Genesis History. You can see Dr. Anderson with the Triceratops horn in that movie. So now I'm going to change directions quickly on you here. I'm going to ask you a question that everybody has in mind out there that's watched Jurassic Park, and that is, can you clone a dinosaur, Dr. Anderson?
Well, the short answer is no. Despite what the Hollywood says, first off, to clone any animal, you have to have its entire set of chromosomes. And obviously, we don't have any chromosomes for the dinosaur.
Yes.
So even if you've had a little bit, you can't clone anything with just a little bit. You got to have it all.
Yes.
But what is fascinating is there's been some very tantalizing evidence that there is still within some of the cells in the dinosaur fossils pieces of DNA. And of course, DNA is even more DNA is even more sensitive. DNA decays even faster than proteins decay. So it's hard enough to explain the proteins. Try to explain the DNA. And so that's going to become even a greater challenge to evolutionists. And so I think if an evolutionist actually does find in their laboratory definitive evidence of DNA, they're going to be in quite a dilemma, because as a scientist, they'll want to publish it, but as evolutionists, they'll know this is going to be very, very damaging to the evolutionary time frame.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking of I can't remember the psalm, but it says, truth springs from the earth. God's word, of course, and here we have evidence. Every time we dig in the ground, archaeology, paleontology, dinosaurs, we find evidence that vindicates the biblical accounts. Tell people in the church why this is so important.
Well, it's important because when you start trying to impose these long ages onto Genesis, science is telling us the earth is billions of years old, that all these fossils are millions of years old. What you're doing is you're distorting the text, and you're making the text say something it doesn't say. And then where does it stop? We've had people actually claim, well, history in the Bible doesn't start until, Genesis 11, Genesis 12, whatever. Well, how do you know?
Yes.
And how do you know that it starts there? Why does it start there? Maybe it doesn't start until Exodus. Maybe it doesn't start until later. You know, the very type of criticisms that you guys get for the Tower of Babel, for the Exodus and such, the same mentality is implied then to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. See, it's been disproven to actually be historical. Therefore, the history in the Bible is flawed. Therefore, the Bible itself is flawed. And we see then the effects of that in the American church and the church worldwide today. Look at Europe. Europe gave up on the authenticity of the Bible decades ago.
Yes.
And when you give up on the authenticity of the Bible, then what do you have? What you have is you have paganism.
Yeah. Thinking about the evolutionist community, okay? We're excited. You and I are beyond excited, and hopefully our audience, about, again, the evidence vindicates the Bible's presentation of history, particularly the early chapters of Genesis. But do the evolutionists accept some of this, not the time frame, because I know what you're going to say about that, but you know that this evidence is real, and what are you seeing as far as how they're dealing with it?
Because the presence of tissue, presence of biological material, particularly protein fragments, is completely inconsistent with their time frame, with the dates they've placed on these fossils, then yes, initially there was great hesitation on the evolutionist community. In fact, that was one of the reasons that Dr. Schweitzer was so hesitant to initially publish the work, because she knew there'd be a lot of pushback. And of course there was. Now, the advantage of that was it required people to do even more careful work.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that the evolutionist community was probably able to dismiss reports that date back to the 60s and 70s and 80s is because technologically you could argue that we just simply couldn't say for certain that it might have been contamination. It might have been something else. There was just too much uncertainty, and they could play into that and say, well, because we can't really believe that this tissue would actually be in these fossils then, or that these proteins would actually be in these fossils, it must be something else. But because the 21st century has seen such technological advancements, see, that argument is very quickly disappearing. My colleague on the iDINO project, one of my colleagues on the iDINO project is Brian Thomas at the Institute of Creation Research, not to be confused with the Creation Research Society.
Yes.
Okay. He has been able to do some work where he has detected collagen still in the bone. It's not a matter of extracting. It's not a matter of detecting by the typical processes that would have been done back in the 80s and 90s and even the early part of the 21st century, but actually take the fossil, put it in the analysis, and actually say right there is collagen. And so you can't call that any kind of misdetection by some kind of lab contamination. And you can't call it lab contamination when you break open the fossil and it's right there.
Yeah.
See, so those arguments are quickly disappearing. Now, ironically, some of the ones still pushing back the hardest, still not fully ready to accept that this is actual, authentic dinosaur biological material that survived all this time, are the biochemists, because the biochemists know better. They know proteins cannot survive that long. So they're in quite a conundrum, especially the biochemists that work with older material. There's a group of them, for example, in Europe, that's their specialty, is working with archaeological samples, for example, and using the decay of the biological material as part of a dating process for the archaeological, for the bone that's been found in the pyramid or in the cave or whatever. And so they have a lot of data that they point to that says we know these proteins can't survive for millions of years. And that data is very good data. And they stand by it. And so they're the ones pushing back the hardest, saying it cannot be.
Yeah.
Now, the irony is, see, they're in that typical conundrum. They're not going to abandon the evolutionary paradigm, which is what the data tells them they should do. They're going to stick to it. They're just going to reject the data. They're going to reject that this can't be actual dinosaur tissue. So, in fact, early in all of this, Dr. Schweitzer talks of a time when she was trying to publish where one of her reviewers is saying that I can't believe this. And she wrote back and she said, well, what evidence would you believe? And says, there's no evidence that you could present that make me believe this. In other words, the paradigm reigns.
Wow. Yeah.
So you cannot say these are younger than millions of years, no matter what the data is.
Yeah. And it does, we talked about it earlier, and I want to emphasize it again for our audience because we talk about it on this program all the time. There's evidence. We talk about archaeology. You're talking about, exploring, looking at dinosaurs.
Paleontology. Yes.
Paleontology, right? Different sciences, but the data has to fit in a paradigm. And
correct.
Worldviews influence the way that people look at things and how they interpret them, and often influence how data is rejected or explained away and all that kind of thing.
I see that in the archaeology world all the time. That
yes.
Their worldview determines that this can't be what it appears to be because that doesn't fit my worldview.
Yeah, that's
not
right.
Scientific, but very human.
Yeah, well, very human, and it shows the spiritual need that is in the scientific community and every community of human beings. That there's a spiritual need to see the world as God has given it and represented it in His revelation. Dr. Anderson, if you could wrap up, I know this has been an enormous subject, but I hope we've done a good job for our folks to understand it. If you could just take about a minute and wrap it up, what you think is most important.
The authenticity of the Bible would mean then that the biblical history is the true history of this earth, not the pagan history we're taught in our textbooks and our science classes.
Yes.
Has nothing to do with biblical history, has nothing to do with God's history of the earth. Okay. Scientifically, we're saying here is evidence that supports God's history of the earth. These dinosaur fossils and other fossils are not millions of years old. They're going to be just a few thousands of years old, as the Bible would tell us.
Yes.
They almost certainly were preserved by being buried in the flood.
In the flood, right.
And that would account also for the rapid burial that would give you tissue preservation. Now, you've got to have precise types of rapid burial. Yeah, exactly. A flood would do that. Other models, they struggle with that some. How did these dinosaur fossils get buried correctly that they would actually preserve for any length of time?
Yeah, that's right.
So while we see scientifically time and time and time again, just as you guys talk about with your archaeology, we would talk about with the paleontology, this supports the biblical history, not the pagan history that we're being taught and that too many Christians are paying attention to. Get back to the biblical history. That's God's history. When you change history, you change everything.
Yes.
That's the point that the Is Genesis History movie made. When you start trying to change the biblical history, you change the entire dynamic of the Bible. Because everything then starts falling apart.
That's a great way to end the program. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
January, when we're re-releasing this interview, is the anniversary of when Dr. Anderson went to be with the Lord. But the work still continues with the iDINO project, as others still continue to make scientific observations in bone fossils. And if you'd like to see Dr. Anderson with the Triceratops horn he was talking about, we put a link in the show notes to a clip from the documentary Is Genesis History that you can check out. Well, that's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.